just because they're a little bit closer to home maybe than some other sins are. There are a lot of sins that we don't mind bringing in the back door, and that we don't mind sitting down on the pew beside us, that we don't mind going home with, that we don't mind waking up with. There are some sins that we've just kind of ignored for a long time because we like them a little bit better. And you know what? Only I know what the inclination of my heart is, and only you know what the inclination of your heart is, but what is the inclination of your heart? Is it towards submission to God? Is it towards obedience to His commands? Maybe not just in all the stuff that people can see out here, but in what happens in the privacy of your own home? What happens when nobody else is around? What is the inclination of your heart? Ask yourself this: do I view other people as equals, as fellow creations of God who are valuable no matter what they have or don't have, what they look like, don't look like, where they come from or where they don't come from? Do I view other people as equals? Or do I believe that I'm better than some other people for some reason or another? That's a pretty pertinent question for this group here especially. You know, something that I run into sometimes when I meet people out in our community, and when I introduce myself as the pastor of First Baptist Church, and when I say, hey, I'd love for you to come worship with us sometimes people say to me, oh no, I couldn't go to First Baptist Church. I don't have nice enough clothes. You know, I don't really fit in with the people who go to First Baptist Church. I don't have enough money, or I don't really, that's the high church there at First Baptist. I wouldn't really feel comfortable there. And some of that probably sometimes is an excuse because people don't want to go to church. But I think there's probably some validity there. You know, this is for the most part the group of people who dresses a little nicer, who drives a little nicer, who lives a little bit nicer. And do you think sometimes maybe we have a tendency, intentionally or not, to look down on other people just because they don't have, or because they don't drive, or because they don't live? I think possibly that we've fostered some of that attitude here. What's the inclination of your heart? Do you think that there are some people out there that you're just better than? Or do you view all people as equals? Here's a third question to ask. Do I treat other people with compassion, especially when they make mistakes or when they are down? Or do I like to point out their failings? Do I like to use their difficult situations and circumstances to make myself look better? Have you ever found yourself in conversation just happening to interject the moral failing of somebody else just as a way of conversation, or just slip it in there just so that you can say, whether you say it or not, hey, at least I'm not like that person? Do you like to use other people's misfortune for your own gain to make yourself look better? Or do you treat other people with compassion? Do you extend a hand to them and try to help them stand up? The way that we answer those questions will go a long ways towards helping us to determine whether our hearts are filled with sinful pride that God hates, or whether they're filled with humility that should characterize believers. We need to ask ourselves those questions. The final question that we need to ask as we wrap this up is this: how can we become people whose lives are characterized by humility? I stated a couple of weeks ago that Solomon's intent in Proverbs is not to give a how-to. It's not to tell you how to move from point A to point B. All Solomon's doing is just making observations about life. All he's doing is saying, here's what happens when you're prideful. Here's what happens when you live with humility. Here are the results. He's not interested in getting you from point A to point B. But you know, there are some times when Solomon says, hey, if you instruct the fool or you instruct the naive, then sometimes they'll gain wisdom. Sometimes somebody moves from being a fool to being somebody who at least possesses some knowledge. He says sometimes, hey, if you discipline your son, even though foolishness is bound up in his heart, you'll drive it far from him. So sometimes a foolish child who has foolishness bound up in his heart can be disciplined, and you can help drive that away. Sometimes somebody can move from being a foolish son to conceivably a wise adult. But Solomon never does talk about somebody who's prideful becoming humble. He never does talk about somebody whose heart is full of sinful pride becoming a person who's bent toward humility. And I think the reason is this: you know, we treat things like pride as the kind of sickness that you go to the doctor and you get an antibiotic for, and you take it for about 3 weeks, and then you feel better and you go on. Or We treat it like the kind of injury that you go to the physical therapist for maybe for a couple of weeks, or maybe you go to the chiropractor and they snap you around a little bit and then you're better. But that's not what pride is. Pride is a deadly disease that requires radically invasive surgery. You see, the disease of pride requires a heart transplant. You don't just try to add some humility to your life and drive the pride out. If you have a heart that's full of sinful pride, then you need a new heart. If you have a heart that's in rebellion against God, that does not want His authority in your life, then you need a new heart. There's only one way for us to get a new heart. God said when we come to Him, and when we acknowledge our sin, and when we admit that there's nothing that we can do to pay for that sin, no way that we can get to where God is, no way we can measure up to what He demands, not what He suggests, but what He demands. When we come to Him, and we acknowledge that, and when we receive the sacrifice of His Son on our behalf by faith, you know what the Bible says God does? He takes out our heart of stone and He puts in a heart of flesh. That's what the prophecy was from the Old Testament on. That's what God was going to do for His people, that He was going to take the heart of stone out of their chest and He was going to put a heart of flesh in, that He was going to write His law on His people's hearts so that they would love to obey Him, so that they would want to obey Him, so that they would be people who were full of humility, not sinful pride. That is the only remedy for sinful pride. You will not cure sinful pride by coming to church 3 times a month, 4 times a month, 10 times a month. You won't cure sinful pride by putting a little more in the offering plate. You won't cure sinful pride by volunteering for 3 committees. You won't cure sinful pride by teaching Sunday school. You will cure sinful pride by having God take your heart of stone out and put a heart of flesh in, and that is the only cure for sinful pride. Now, once God has done that, sometimes there are still some remnants there. We might have to go for some periodic radiation treatment there. We might have to go every once in a while to have God cleanse some of those remnants out. But there's only one cure for sinful pride, and that is a total heart transplant. And that is something that only happens when we come to God, when we acknowledge our sin, when we receive the forgiveness that He gives,